Greece has been the focus of the financial community since 2010, but reckless monetary policy runs deep in the country's history. In the 19th century, shortly after gaining independence, the government had already declared 3 consecutive bankruptcies. The reason for this was because independent Greece was born in debt. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Today's content is sponsored by Reiner United Media, which specializes in working with small, medium businesses on their online marketing needs. They provide you with everything from start to finish: consulting, website, landing page, SEO, to compete with larger companies at an affordable price. If you've been considering to expand your digital footprint, check out Reiner United Media. Just visit the link in the description and use the code Caspian on the contract form to get $500 discount on your first website and free consultation. In 1821, after almost 400 years of Ottoman rule, Greek revolutionaries took up arms and fought to create a state of their own. One settlement at a time, Greece was slipping out of Ottoman hands. In the city of Nafplio, the revolutionaries established a provincial capital and declared the Hellenic Provisional Administration. The newly formed government immediately began to tender for international financial support, seeing loans as a tool for legitimizing the government. In the financial centers of London and Paris, investors rushed to organize loans for the young state. However, contrary to the norms of financial mediation, whereby a principal, agent, and creditor would be privy to the same information, the Hellenic Provisional Administration existed in an information bubble separate from the bustling markets of Western Europe. This uneven relationship between the disorganized Hellenic government, its various agents in Europe, and the international financiers resulted in 2 loans that couldn't possibly be repaid. Administered as sovereign bonds on the London stock market, the 1824 and 1825 loans were quickly bought up by investors who placed their bets in the future of the new breakaway republic. However, when British policymakers started buying and selling those bonds at the London Exchange, the financial undertaking took on a political shape. And when the Greek independence war turned in favor of the Ottomans, the investments in the war bonds dropped. Then, in 1827, just as the Ottomans were winning, the Greek government defaulted on its debts, as it could no longer afford to pay the loan interests. Back in London, the British elites were on the verge of losing their capital, so British lobbying groups encouraged the government to assemble a coalition of European navies to aid the Greeks. That is exactly what happened at the Battle of Navarino in 1827, when the European coalition sunk the Ottoman fleet, thereby granting the Greeks the decisive upper hand. As a result, the price of the war bonds skyrocketed and the wealthy lobbyists in London became even more prosperous. For Greece, however, the story was different. The Greeks had broken free from the Ottomans, but in the process, they had exchanged their economic well-being for political independence. The fact is that the terms of Greece's independence was negotiated at the behest of British policymakers, diaspora lobbies, and foreign bondholders. One of those terms, as stipulated in the London Protocol of 1830, was that the Greek government agreed to pay back the remaining loans despite having defaulted on it earlier. In another term, in 1832, Greece was declared an absolute monarchy, and the European stakeholders appointed 17-year-old Bavarian Prince Otto Friedrich Ludwig as the monarch in waiting, with an interim council of Bavarian aristocrats maintaining the rule. It was a significant blow to the Greek revolutionaries, who had essentially replaced one foreign monarch with another. Meanwhile, the European empires imposed a contract upon the new Bavarian Greek Regency to prioritize the repayment of the country's debts. To ensure the cooperation of the new Bavarian monarch of Greece, the Europeans established their own political parties to maintain pressure. Greek politics came to be dominated by the English, French, and Russian parties. The peculiar relationship between the Bavarian Greek advisors and the European empires became known as the Troika. And to kickstart the interest repayments, in 1832, the Troika negotiated a new loan of 60 million francs, of which only 2.7 million francs actually entered the Greek economy, with the remaining of the new loan being devoted to repaying the previous debts. It still wasn't enough. Unable to repay its old and new debts, the Troika imposed strict austerity measures on Greek citizens. In a blatant violation of the Greek constitution, the Bavarian king was given unilateral power regarding taxation. Otto and his advisors decided to provide the struggling Greek peasantry with government loans with a 3% down payment in cash. It sounded practical on paper, but the hefty tax on land production left the Greek farmers with no means of disposable income. To afford the down payment, Greek citizens ended up buying from wealthy private individuals, which happened to be the Greek diaspora and the merchant class. So basically, the state had taken out loans to repay the previous loans and then extended new loans to its citizens, who in turn had to take out their own loans to get access to the government-funded loans. In a tragedy of Hellenic proportions, the young nation's attempt to pay off its international debt resulted in an increasingly indebted population. Ottoman discriminatory taxation had been replaced by a plutocracy of foreign bankers and merchants. Eventually, in 1843, the program backfired and Otto was forced to declare sovereign default. Policymakers and stockholders in London and Paris reacted to the news with fury, and in 1853, with the start of the Crimean War, Britain and France had their excuse to renegotiate terms. Greece had joined Russia's side on the conflict, which gave the British and French navies the pretext to occupy the port of Piraeus, which was the gateway of Athens. At the backdrop of the occupation, Britain, France, and Greece renegotiated the repayment of the previous loans, an understanding that resulted in even more austerity measures on the Greek population. King Otto had fallen out of favor among the Greek society and was eventually overthrown a decade later. As the Bavarian king was removed from office by a military coup, the European powers appointed a new king from their ranks, George I, a 17-year-old Danish prince. George attempted to carry out some reforms, but the truth was that the Greek government and peasantry was heavily indebted. Still, despite all the hardships, the government of George was able to repay the 1832 debt. However, having done so, the stakeholders then insisted that the loans of 1824 and 1825 also be reimbursed. Just as this request was made, the long depression of the 1870s set in. The powerhouses in Europe contracted, but in Greece, the economy had come to a standstill. The inability of the government to service external debt prohibited the country from accessing international credit markets. The government in Athens was ill-prepared for the economic depression and defaulted on its standing obligations in 1893. In case you lost count, this was the third default since independence. Greece as a state was kept afloat only by its strategic importance to West European powers. At the same time, nationalist sentiment was strong in Greece, and the public tolerated the economic meltdown while waiting for a second chance to strike at the Turks. That conflict broke out in 1897, only 5 years after the third default, but the Greeks soon found themselves ill-prepared and were utterly defeated. For stockholders in Europe, however, the armed conflict was a win-win. To pay for the Ottoman war reparation, the Greek government negotiated additional loans. But since the country had declared bankruptcy a few years earlier, its credit rating was injured. Hence, the loan for the war reparation were exceptionally costly. By this time, Athens had little to no political authority at home or abroad to negotiate the terms of its debt, and thus had to once more surrender its economic development and fiscal authority to foreign supervision. Representatives of bondholders from Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, and Austria-Hungary set up a council known as the International Financial Control Committee, or IFC for short, to run the public finances of Greece. Taking up residency in Athens, the IFC oversaw the repayment of all Greek loans thus far acquired. As such, the IFC took up the mantle of the Troika, albeit with greater zeal. In doing so, the IFC instituted the infamous Laws of Control, which restricted infrastructure development and seized custom duties of several major ports. The constant neglect of critical infrastructure rendered the country unable to serve its own needs. This is why Greek maritime industries and self-sufficiency in food production lingered far behind other European nations. Nevertheless, Athens was powerless to stop the IFC, and this state of affairs remained in place up to the Nazi occupation of the country in 1942. By then, foreign monetary supervision had become part of the genetics of the Greek state, permanently entrenched in its politics. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Special thanks to Alexander Perton for helping me write this report, and our community on Patreon for giving us the means to produce content like this. If you want to learn more, check out the links in the description. Thank you for watching, and Saul.